Welcome to the Restless Theologian podcast, where we focus on having insightful conversations in biblical history and theology. I'm your host, Zechariah. For our fifth episode of Season 3, we are going to be discussing a line that's in the Apostles' Creed. He was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. We're going to be exploring what happened exactly after Christ died and what was going on between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And in order to unpack this topic with me, I have my wife on today to kind of go through this. How you doing, Kathryn?
Good. How are you?
Good.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. I haven't had you on yet this season.
No.
Yeah.
We've been pretty busy.
Yeah.
Just wedding plans and all that, but
yep.
It's good to be back.
Yeah. Glad to have you back. I always enjoy our conversations together.
Me too.
What we're going to look at today, just to kind of cover a little bit of ground, we're going to be looking at what the Bible says about the descent, what the church fathers and what some of the reformers' views. We're going to briefly touch on that. And then we're going to look at the theories about the atonement that are kind of connected to the descent of Christ. So there's three different main ideas, and there's a little bit of sub-level ideas surrounding where Jesus went and what he did after he died. Now, the three different main views from a high level are going to be the paradise only, that Jesus, he went to heaven. That's where his soul, that's where his spirit was taken. And so Jesus went immediately to paradise with the thief on the cross, because as we know in Luke 23:43, the thief on the cross does ask Christ to remember him and his kingdom. And Jesus responds with, today you will be with me in paradise. The second view is that when Christ died, he went to Abraham's bosom, which is the realm of the righteous dead, which is a part of Hades. So Jesus descended to the righteous in Hades. Now, Hades is a Greek term, and it means like the realm of the dead, and it is pretty much the equivalent of what the Hebrews used the term for Sheol. So Sheol and Hades, for the most part, seem pretty interchangeable. It's just obviously Hades is a Greek term. So in this understanding that Abraham's bosom, there's also this idea that he actually... that Hades itself has two sections, one for the righteous and one for the wicked. And this view also connects with Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 to 53, which describes saints rising and appearing to many after Christ's resurrection, which is potentially a sign of their liberation and glorification. And the other view, the third and last view, is going to be that Jesus, when he descended to Tartarus. And what he was doing there was proclaiming judgment over rebellious angels from Noah's day. And this is kind of discussed, or kind of like the term for it would be Christus Victor. And it has a lot to do with Christ triumphing over evil and demonic powers. So, after going through all that, we're going to unpack it. And where would you like to start with, Kathryn? Do you want to go over the key scripture passages, or you want to go immediately to the understandings of what those three terms mean: Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus?
Either way.
You want to? Okay, let's start there.
Yeah,
and then maybe we'll work our way back to the biblical
I will
passages.
say, just going back to when you're talking about the creed, and just. It is pretty amazing how, growing up, we would say the creed all the time. I grew up Catholic, so we would say the creed at every mass. And, even when I was younger and that would come up where he descended into hell, I did not know what that meant. It wasn't until I got older and became an adult and started kind of looking more into it, what does that mean exactly? But it is interesting to go through these different views that we kind of were talking about last night. So yeah, we can always start with the scripture readings if you want.
Okay, we'll start there then.
Okay.
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind reading for me 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20.
Okay. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water.
And then can you also read for us Ephesians 4, and this is going to be verses 8 through 10.
Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he also descended into the lower regions, the earth? He who descended is the one who has also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So in Ephesians 4, from what I looked up for the Greek term, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but it literally translates that he led captivity captive. And what this is a poetic idiom, and it emphasizes complete victory. So essentially what it's saying is Christ himself captures the captors. Now, what is meant by the captors could be the death, demons, or spiritual powers.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a closer look at that view because that matches, like I said, the third concept of where Christ went when he died, and that would have been Tartarus. So, and this is Acts chapter 2, verses 27. It says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." Now, this harkens back to David in the Psalms. David is the original speaker. And then in this context in Acts, Peter is the one who is basically rephrasing it, not rephrasing it, but I should say hearkening back to it. So when he says, "For you will not abandon my soul or let your Holy One see corruption." So whose soul and who's the Holy One? It would be, from my understanding, it's Christ and his soul, and that he is the Holy One being described that's not going to see corruption. Mm-hmm. And then in Acts, same chapter, but verse 31, it says, "He foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption." So the reason why I brought this up was because I wanted to just kind of think about what is meant that Christ was not abandoned to Hades. There's a couple different ways we can look at this, I think, is that maybe Christ did descend into Hades. That meaning the realm of the dead, and we'll kind of unpack what that means a little bit. But so it could mean that he went there, but he wasn't abandoned there. He didn't remain there. Or it could potentially mean that he never went there. He was not abandoned to Hades. He did not have to go there. This would closely align with I believe it was the first view that we had brought up, that he entered into paradise only.
Yeah.
So he would not have gone to Hades.
I'm guessing that would be more of like the Reformed view, correct?
That's correct.
If, because I know we're going to talk about it a little bit later, because that makes sense when they, since they believe it to be like the suffering of Christ on the cross.
Correct.
But
yeah.
After, his last breath on the cross, he would have gone straight to heaven.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when it talks about, for example, the Heidelberg Catechism, briefly brings up in one of its answers that what is meant by, in the Apostles' Creed, that he descended into hell, was that it was basically meaning the torment of his, basically the torment that he went through with his crucifixion and the pain and anguish that he went through. So basically going to the depths of hell, essentially, in his body. And this goes right into what we were talking about. The next verse was Luke 23:43, when Jesus responds to the thief on the cross, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And then one last biblical passage we want to bring up is Revelation chapter 1, 17 through 18. And it says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he, meaning Christ, laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not, I am the first and the last, the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So there's a distinction that is clearly being made between death and Hades. And one is representing that Jesus has authority over both death and Hades. So he has authority over the state of death and over the realm of the dead. So Hades is basically the intermediate realm of the dead. Obviously, as I mentioned before, that's equivalent to Sheol in the Hebrew concept. And it is a temporary place, and it's not necessarily a place of torment. So it's not a place of punishment or anything like that. It's just a holding place for the dead before the final judgment. So it's also associated with the grave or the underworld, and not to be confused with the final judgment. And so this is where I wanted to kind of dive into subcategories under Hades. So one of them being that it's believed that Abraham's bosom is a part of Hades, and it's a place of comfort and not punishment. And I've heard some people say that it is heaven, which I could see that being a plausible argument. Have you ever heard that?
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
No.
That when someone's taken up to Abraham's side or Abraham's bosom, it is meaning that they're being taken up to heaven.
Okay.
Another category would be Tartarus. Now, Tartarus, from my understanding, is that it's actually a level in Hades, but the lowest level. Tartarus is mentioned only in one place in the New Testament, which is 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4. Now, Tartarus is kind of a unique term. It's a Greek term, and it's where God holds the rebellious angels in chains until Judgment Day. And it's not to be confused with just Hades in general, because from what I've looked up, it does sound like it's maybe a level in Hades, but it's also not to be confused with hell, which is Gehenna. So, and there's a couple passages that, if you wouldn't mind reading them for me, let's start with 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4.
For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Okay, and
what translation do you have up?
That's ESV.
ESV, yeah. ESV is a common one I use too. So I'm glad you read from the ESV, because the translation I put in my notes are from the Lexham English Bible. And I guess the actual Greek term is, so I'll just read you what the Lexham version says. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but held them captive in Tartarus with chains of darkness and handed them over to be kept for judgment. And your version says hell. I browsed through a lot of different English translations, and the majority of them do say hell. But when I looked it up, the more accurate translation is Tartarus, and it probably shouldn't have been translated to be hell. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting, because you kind of have you noticed that the same thing happens with Hades?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hell and Hades are used interchangeably.
Yeah.
And I think from my train of thought, like, I found that really confusing, especially growing up, because I thought they were the same thing, but it sounds like Hades and hell are not.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense in regards to being in the Apostles' Creed then too. Like, what did they really mean by hell, Yeah. So.
Yeah. And then can you read the book of Jude, chapter 1, verse 6 for me?
Yes. And I'll read do you want me to read the Lexham version? Okay. I'm sorry. In the angels who did not keep to their own domain, but deserted their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal bonds under deep gloom for the judgment of the great day.
Okay. Next, we'll jump to Gehenna, and then after we kind of talk about Gehenna, then we're going to kind of unpack these passages. Okay. So Gehenna, the word basically is it's the final punishment place for the wicked, and it is rooted in the valley of Hinnom, which is a real location outside of Jerusalem, which was associated with idolatry and basically burning trash. So Gehenna symbolizes God's final judgment, and it is the equivalent of hell. For what I were to guess is that anytime the word Gehenna is used, it's going to be translated hell into English, because I believe they are one and the same. But I think the issue is with some of the New Testament translations, both Tartarus and Hades are also translated hell. So it kind of gives us a little bit more of a misunderstood view of a lot of other topics, I think, because I see how it kind of blurred my view in some of these different passages, because if it's not really hell, then that kind of changes the overall meaning of the text, right?
Yeah.
So going back to 2 Peter 2, verse 4, about that God did not spare the angels who sinned. This is supposedly believed to be the angels who sinned are the fallen angels that are referenced in Genesis 6. The ones that basically intermingled with human women. And then obviously in Jude 1:6, the angels that did not keep their own domain, but desired their own proper dwelling place, God kept them in eternal bonds. So there's this idea that they've been put into Tartarus, which is a place that's like the lowest abyss of Hades, and that they're kept in chains there. Right? Is that what you are taken from it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it almost makes me wonder, so the judgment day. So do you think that would be when he descended into hell, that was their judgment day? Or is it still going to be later on for that judgment day? Because even if here's just what I'm thinking.
No,
here's just what I'm thinking right now. I just thought of this right now. So say he descended to Hades and Tartarus. Is that how you say it? Tartarus?
Well, yeah, it would make sense that if he descended into Hades and Tartarus
is a part of Hades.
It is essentially, or I should say potentially, a part of Hades, but the lowest part.
Yeah.
And not the same as Abraham's bosom. So, I mean, but obviously it's the same place.
It makes me think that Jesus descended there to proclaim the good news, proclaim his gospel, liberating the souls in Hades that are in Abraham's bosom. So all those, the people of the Old Testament who are in Abraham's bosom, but then also declaring judgment on the angels in Tartarus. But yeah, it is really interesting to think about those two ideas possibly being together.
Yeah, because I didn't think that they were mutually exclusive. You know, I didn't think that like the idea that he went and descended into Abraham's bosom, a part of Hades. And I think that this kind of closely is kind of tied with, let me see if I can find it in my notes. Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 verses 53. Let me see if I can get that pulled up. It says, "The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." Now, I feel like anytime that's read in a lot of churches, or just, I feel like it's glossed over, because to me that sounds like a resurrection, right? Like it's just, so they're coming out of their tombs at the same time he is coming out of his tomb, or shortly thereafter.
Is it? Or I thought it was when the curtain of the temple was torn in two. So wouldn't that be right after his crucifixion? After he died? That's
what I thought. But in verse 53, it says, "And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many."
Oh, yeah. I didn't catch that.
Yeah. So there's this idea.
So he went to liberate those souls. Like he went to deliver them out.
Yeah. I guess the question would be so Hades is a place for the soul, right? And not the body.
Mm-hmm, correct.
So if people are coming out of the grave, and it does use the term body, which I found like an interesting, note, because let's see, it says, "And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised." So they're raised. There's a resurrection. And I feel like that's not something that's ever really brought up. I never hear anyone talk about it. And so I thought that was interesting. So what this could be is maybe a first resurrection, I think could be correlated to the book of Revelation, where, you know how there's like 12,000 or is it 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel that are saved? So that would be the 144,000.
Oh.
So I think when we read the book of Revelation, it's often, you know, those people who are premillennialists will see everything that happens in Revelation being in the future.
Yeah.
But obviously, as we talked about last night.
So you think possibly the 144,000 are the people of the Old Testament that were resurrected when Christ was resurrected?
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I've never heard anyone bring that up, and maybe I'm grasping at straws here.
Wow.
But isn't that kind of an interesting thought, though? I mean, I just don't understand how else we can explain this passage. I mean, it doesn't use the term 144,000, but it does talk about in the book of Revelation, because if we look at the language which John uses in Revelation, some of the stuff I think could have already come to pass. Some of the stuff is going to happen soon, because he uses the term these things will soon take place. So maybe not like let's go to you brought it up before, but the dragon waging war on the woman, and the woman actually is supposed to represent Israel. Now, I think that who's to say that the waging of war on the woman didn't happen right away, which was the persecution and execution of the saints in the early days of the church. So, you know, like the timeline's important here. So I don't want to get too sloppy with the timeline, but it is a potential that I could see. Because like I said, I think that not everything that John talks about is necessarily always in the future. It could maybe be a little bit, you know,
correct.
Past, present, and future, maybe. Okay. So moving on from that. Yeah. So what you had talked about earlier, and I'm trying to think of what it was, it sounded similar to when you quoted 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, it made me think of that passage. And I'll just repeat it here again. It says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but being made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water." So I want to kind of fixate a little bit here on "and proclaim to the spirits in prison," because you had made a comment about when Christ goes to Hades, that he's either preaching the gospel, which that's a view that's held, or it's proclamation. So it's not necessarily preaching the gospel, like trying to convince them, but it's maybe like a declaration statement.
Yeah.
Could you see that? So it looks like the Greek word used for proclamation is kuriso, which typically means to announce or to herald. It doesn't necessarily necessitate that it means to evangelize. So I guess what are we to make of this? What kind of proclamation is he making? It could be a declaration of his victory, or it could be his declaration of victory to the righteous that are in Abraham's bosom, or it could also be a declaration, a judgment being made on the wicked, the wicked spirits. So what is your take on it?
All the above.
Could potentially be both.
Yeah.
He descended into Hades and he proclaimed victory over the death and Satan and his enemies. And it also could be a proclamation of judgment to the fallen angels that are in Tartarus. Because as we know, the proclamation, if we take the view that the proclamation is being made to the fallen angels, we know that that proclamation isn't the gospel being preached and trying to convince them to repent, because not only the book of Enoch aside that says there's no repentance for the fallen angels, that God's not going to offer that to them. The New Testament actually, apocryphal books aside, note that there's no salvation for the fallen angels.
Yeah. It almost makes me wonder, and you can cut this part out if you want to. Like, this is the start of the heavenly kingdom with his resurrection and him bringing the saints to heaven with him. And then also declaring that those fallen angels be like judged and sent to hell. So no longer being in that Tartarus state, but being in hell.
Yeah.
So he's establishing both heaven and hell when it comes to those who were on the earth at one point before his death and resurrection.
Say that last part again.
Obviously, I know he created heaven and earth. Like, it's almost like he's starting to establish the souls that are going to be in heaven with him when he's resurrected.
Yeah.
So those who are in Abraham's bosom from the Old Testament, and then also declaring that the fallen angels shall be sent to hell and no longer in that Tartarus state. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah. The timeline. The timeline's a little tricky here, because I could see that he's pronouncing judgment on them, and then he's pronouncing judgment on them, and then essentially is sending them to hell.
That also explains he has the keys to death and Hades.
Yeah. Because if Tartarus is a part of Hades, obviously he has the key to that.
Yeah.
So it could be him potentially unlocking it and sending them to where they, where their final destination it would be. So Jude 1 verse 6 near the end of the passage, it says, he has kept them in eternal bonds under deep gloom for the judgment of the great day. So that great day could be the final judgment. So I think I would think that they could be judged along with humanity on the last day, or they could be judged right away when he, if he descends into Hades, because obviously there's something happening here, right? Like, people are rising out of their graves, and so they're no longer held in that state. And I'd be really curious to know if all of Hades is under the rule or dominion of the devil, or if it's just the part of maybe Tartarus. I don't know. Maybe
it was until Christ
That's
died,
what I mean. Yeah.
And then he claimed victory. Yeah.
Yep.
I can see how in 1 Peter 2, like, we didn't really talk about this too much, but the parallel, this is what we heard last night when we watched that video, and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas agree with this, but like the parallel between like the flood and Noah's family being rescued on the ark and being saved, and that correlation with our baptism, just about how we're united with Christ's death and his resurrection. I can see why that thought is also
advocated for.
Yeah.
Well, there are kind of some correlations being made there, because I believe it's the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is mentioning, so as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Mm-hmm. So, you have that being stated. And then also, too, in Matthew chapter 16, because I think the Olivet Discourse is Matthew 18. Matthew chapter 16, when Jesus is speaking to, he's talking to the disciples, and then Peter obviously is the one who answers first about who do people say that I am? Peter responds with, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus makes this statement, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And then, he makes a note that the gates of Hades will not conquer the church. Mm-hmm. As me and Corey kind of discussed in another one of our episodes, is that the Gentile world at that time, they believed where Christ was at, like the Mount Hermon area, that they believed that was a gateway to the underworld. So it's kind of interesting to see all the correlations there.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of unity of thought as into what's the correct view, if that makes sense, where I feel like a lot of different theologians throughout history, whether it's early church fathers or reformers, seem to be a little bit more, I don't want to say all over the place, but a little bit more of like have their own interpretations of this.
Yeah, like this could be a possibility of what it means.
Yeah, so Irenaeus thought that when Jesus died, that he preached to the righteous dead. Tertullian also affirmed this, that there's a literal descent into hell. His descent into hell, like his death, burial, resurrection, and his descent into hell or Hades, like those views are all kind of connected to the doctrine of the atonement. Now, we're not going to go too deep down that path of the atonement, but I figured we would briefly touch on it here. But it is connected, right? Because it's like, what was the purpose of what he was doing when he died? Mm-hmm. Is it connected to his atoning work on the cross, or his mission for why he came?
Yeah.
Right. So Origen, for example, he believed that Jesus was a ransom that was paid to Satan, and that basically that God, the Father, had tricked Satan into accepting Jesus as a ransom. And then Gregory of Nyssa, he expanded upon Origen's view that Christ basically tricked Satan. And that's the thing. It's like, how did he trick Satan? Like, do you think that the devil knew that Jesus was divine, or do you think that he just thought that God became incarnate? And because there's a whole concept that he emptied himself, right? The concept of kenosis, like he was made lower than the angels. Jesus emptied himself.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in a way, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, like how he tricked Satan, but maybe in a way Satan did think that he could like defeat Jesus, you know, maybe that was his like thought of him being here on earth. Like, oh, he's weakened, I'm going to get him, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Like, did he know that he was divine, even though he lowered himself? Maybe he thought he didn't bring his divinity with him. I don't know.
Yeah. Like, there's a lot of, from my end, there's a lot of interesting little pieces, parts to when Christ and his ministry is going around. Like, the demons recognized him, right? Because, you know, like, the Gadarene demoniac basically says, what do we have to do with you, Jesus, Son of God? Or have you come to torment us before the time? And so it's like they recognized him as the Son of God, right? But like there does seem to be some mystery around why Christ did some of the things that he did when it came to, he would warn the demons basically to not declare who he was.
Yeah.
And then he would even warn people he would heal. And then he would make a statement of like, you know, don't tell people who I am unless something worse will fall upon, you know, if you do, something worse will fall upon you.
Yeah.
Like why the secret? You know what I mean? Like,
and I think we're going to get into that later, right? In regards to what are the possibility or what are the reasons for why he did that?
Here's some possible reasons given when I looked it up. So it could be a timing thing because his hour had not yet come. It could be to avoid any sort of confrontation with the authorities before he has to be betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane by Judas. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe it was a little bit of that. Like it was to avoid having the the Pharisees and Sadducees rise up against Jesus early and take him. Like, obviously, God has control over that stuff.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to note that he is like warning them not to declare who he was. And the last possible reason why he did it could potentially be it's a strategic move on his part, and he's trying to intentionally be deceptive, where he is concealing himself in his true identity from the devil, which would fall in that line of a little bit more of Origen and Gregory of Nyssa's viewpoint that the devil was tricked into accepting Christ. And then since Christ in his divinity, it's like he swallowed up death, and death could not contain him.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting when I was looking into this part too. I found a quote by Athanasius actually, and his, what he said, and this is a quote: Jesus silenced the demons because he did not wish that the truth should proceed from an unclean mouth. So that was his thoughts on why he silenced the demons.
Okay. Yeah, which could potentially be, but it also doesn't explain why he would tell people that he healed too. The same
Correct.
thing.
Yeah. Because he told people also not to, and it could be, he didn't want a big crowd around him at all times following him and bringing attention to him, causing an uprise, because obviously that's not what he was intending. He wasn't to start a war, that type of war.
Yeah.
That a lot of them thought he was there to do.
Oh yeah, there's times when Jesus disrupted the Pharisees and Sadducees so much that they were trying to take hold of him, whether to try to stone him or throw him off a cliff or whatever their intentions were.
Yeah.
It sounded like that they were trying to capture him and he would escape.
Yeah.
So maybe it could have been trying to avoid those type of scenarios. So that's the thing with the atonement. The atonement's very interesting because some of these atonement concepts that are kind of tied to, like Christus Victor is the concept that obviously he had defeated over death, his cosmic triumph over the demonic powers. And that's kind of more closely associated with the proclamation to the fallen angels. I don't think it's exclusively so, but I mean, it does seem like it's very closely connected to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess with all three different possible potentialities, I guess, I could see all three of them being possible. Because even the paradise only view, if Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," to the thief on the cross, right? Like I said, it goes back to a timeline thing, because it's like that doesn't necessarily necessitate that he didn't descend into Hades, but then also immediately after making his proclamation and then his spirit ascending into heaven.
Because in the afterworld, who's to say how time works?
Yeah.
I mean, here on Earth, to us, it was 3 days.
Yeah.
Or, to people that lived back then when they... But yeah, so that's 3 days. But like in the afterworld or in the afterlife, who's to say how time works exactly? So he could have very well been in heaven with him that day,
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think that, like I said, today you'll be with me in paradise. He could be referencing his divinity too. Like that's another potential reasoning where it's like, it doesn't necessarily, like I favor the idea that obviously that he went to heaven right away. But I could also see the idea that, how do we explain those people who resurrected? Like I said, that gets glossed over all the time. Like I feel like no one talks about it, but I feel like it's pretty big news when people start rising out of the graves and how many people. It doesn't really say.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would fall in line with, hey, is that a first potential resurrection?
Yeah.
Going off of the other ideas of the atonement, because I could see how Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, their view of like tricking Satan and, about the ransom view, I could see that being directly tied to his descent into hell, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't want to leave out those views of the or that view of the atonement. So the other one actually kind of reverses it. The Reformed view is, I find, very fascinating, of course. So Calvin, for example, he believed that the descent into hell that's referenced in the Apostles' Creed means suffering God's wrath, not really a location that Christ himself went to. And then Luther seems like he affirmed the descent into hell, but he seems a little bit more vague as to it's a little bit more of a mystery. We don't really know. Because it is a little bit more speculative. I can't say that, it doesn't seem like anyone knows for sure. We're just given these glimpses into what the Bible says about what Christ did. And so the penal substitutionary atonement view is kind of derived from Anselm's view, because Anselm, actually, he rejected the ransom to Satan theory, and he proposed a new theory, is that basically Christ, when he died on the cross, it was restoring divine honor. And the Reformers kind of built upon his view. So the ransom that was paid was not to the devil in this view. It kind of flips it. The ransom was paid to God, right? And with penal substitutionary atonement, this is kind of closely related to Yom Kippur, which we watched a video on last night. Did you have anything that you wanted to bring up about Yom Kippur, anything that you found interesting about it?
Maybe just what I talked to you about just before we started the episode, but to think about Jesus representing both goats in that sacrifice. In the Old Testament, a sacrifice of the unblemished, perfect lamb to God.
Yep.
And then the goat they transferred the sins of the people onto the one goat that they sent out into outside of the
camp.
Into the desert to wander, and then would eventually just die.
Because that Sproul has a really interesting video about I think it's just called the curse motif in, I think it's the book of Leviticus, I believe, but basically on Yom Kippur, I think it's the Day of the Atonement. Now, there's some biblical evidence too to kind of back this theory up about penal substitutionary atonement. And I'll say this is that he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. So you have that transference, you have that imputation. That's one. Two, you have the idea, I think it's Paul talks about this, and he harkens back to the Old Testament about there being the passage that cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. And then obviously Christ hung on a tree. And, there's that passage that Christ came to give himself as a ransom for many. So there's that ransom type language being... Yeah.
It is interesting how Calvin kind of went off the satisfaction theory. Because I'm pretty sure that's mostly what the Catholic Church holds to, is the satisfactory theory.
That's the thing. I think that...
it's almost like Calvin kind of extended it into more the penal substitution. Yeah,
because so they would hold to a satisfaction theory. So both are satisfaction theories, right? Yeah. I think the difference, from what I can tell, the difference would be for penal substitutionary atonement is the fact that it is it's a ransom being paid to God, and it is more of God's wrath being poured out on Christ. So basically, he pays the penalty due to our sins, which I think, from a Catholic perspective, obviously, the Catholic Church would hold that that obviously Christ did pay for sins on the cross, right? He died for people's sins. But where they would deviate would be that they don't think that it's God's wrath being poured out on God the Son from God the Father, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, Scripture does repeatedly talk about God's wrath towards the wicked, and I guess the idea would be, how do you placate that? If I'm using that term correctly, how do you level that, right? Like if if God is angry with the wicked, and no wickedness can enter into his domain, his territory, into heaven where he resides, full satisfaction has to be made.
Yeah.
So both parties would agree that satisfaction has to be made one way or the other. But in more of the penal substitutionary atonement is that there's that double imputation where Christ, he takes all of the sins, all of our burdens. He takes all of that on himself, and then he transfers and gives us his righteousness. So that's a double imputation view, and one that I think that people think is primarily an innovation that came with the Reformation, but I don't really see it that way because Augustine, in one of his works, basically says the same thing. And which I found to be really kind of fascinating because it's like sometimes in theology, there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily new, but just kind of reworded or built upon, right? Because with Jehovah's Witnesses, their non-Trinitarianism is not anything new. Arius talked about it first.
Yeah.
So some of these, whether it's good theology or bad theology, sometimes they have ancient origins. But yeah, so there was a little bit of kind of, we were talking a little bit earlier, and I wanted to get a little bit more of your take on it. So with Yom Kippur, you have the sins of the people being transferred to the goat. And from what you remember, it's not the goat that's sacrificed, right? It's the goat that's actually sent out into the wilderness.
Pretty sure it's the one that's sent out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I kind of missed that part of the video. So the goat, you think both goats kind of represent two different roles that Jesus does.
In the theory that you're bringing up in regards to
penal substitutionary atonement.
Yeah, but what did you call it?
I think double imputation is probably a part of penal substitutionary atonement.
That's kind of what that reminds me of. That would make sense that if he were to represent both goats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because it's what's kind of crazy about Yom Kippur and the language that's being used is that there was one goat that was for the Lord and one for Azazel. Mm-hmm. The only other time I've read the name Azazel was in the book of Enoch, and it's a fallen angel. And of like, I think he's actually cast out into a desert place, which would be
makes sense.
Which would be Tartarus, and also too the whole on Yom Kippur when they would send the goat out with the sins of the people, like obviously send it outside the camp, they would put them into the desert. Mm-hmm. And then they obviously would probably eventually die from heat or starvation or whatever. I want to focus on that a little bit. Do you think that when the other goat is sent out into the desert, that it's a representation of Christ being like almost like abandoned on the cross? Because obviously with penal substitutionary atonement, a big verse I think is where Jesus says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Yeah.
This harkens back to the book of the Psalms, where David quotes this. And I don't think Jesus is necessarily just quoting. I think that David is prophesying that this is what Jesus is going to say.
Yeah.
I'm sure obviously Jesus would know that, but so there's that idea that he was almost like forsaken because he bore the sins of the people. Yeah. God's wrath is being poured out on him. So in a way, it's I don't want to say abandoned, but forsaken temporarily.
Yeah.
And I also could see the goat being sent out into the desert could also be representative of Christ when he dies, descending into Hades. And since, like I said, the desert place that Azazel is sent to, they describe it in the book of Enoch as like a deserty place in the abyss. I think there's a connection there. It's basically what I'm getting at.
No, I could see that.
Yeah,
definitely.
So it's not that the other goat or other lamb is necessarily, it's not obviously not sacrificed to Azazel, and some actually hypothesize that Azazel is just a place, meaning like the desert, not really meaning to be a specific person or demon. But yeah, I did find those connections kind of interesting, how they all kind of tie together.
So when it comes to the satisfactions theory, I think we can both agree, like Jesus through his obedience, made a complete and sufficient sacrifice for humanity's disobedience to God, which then balanced out the injustice that was caused by sin.
Yeah.
At the start of humanity.
Yeah, at the fall.
Yeah.
So yeah, now that we've kind of unpacked a little bit of this, I mean, it's a lot to absorb, and there's a lot of potentialities here. I thought it was worth mentioning that all three, not all three are necessarily mutually exclusive. I would say that the ones that are most opposed to each other are probably that he ascended into heaven right away and that he was only in heaven when he died. I would think that would conflict with the other two views. Mm-hmm. But like we talked about, obviously, it's the time frame there and how time works. I don't know if it works differently or it's the exact same in the afterlife. But yeah, so there's, after bringing up the scriptures and what some of the early church fathers have mentioned, I think it's given us a lot to digest. And I think in summary, though, I think what it kind of goes back to that Revelation passage, right? That Christ has like dominion, he has authority, which what the keys kind of represent a little bit of, mm-hmm. of that he has the keys of death and Hades.
Yeah.
And it's really important to kind of know which actual version of the word is being used, because some of these translations aren't necessarily the most accurate. Not that they're bad translations necessarily, but like some of those small terms could make a big difference, right? Like mm-hmm. When we talk about, I'm with you even until the end of the age. So anytime the word age is used in the New Testament, I think it was maybe in the King James Version, they would always use the world, the end of the world. And the end of the age and the end of the world might not necessarily be the same thing.
Yeah.
So was there anything else you kind of wanted to touch on before we close?
No, I think we went over quite a bit.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, Katie. I mean,
you're welcome.
I think next topic we're going to discuss is, I think the filioque is the one I'm leaning towards. Okay. So we'll probably have an episode on that soon, because it is a important doctrine and one that separates Eastern Christians from Western Christians, and one I think that the East particularly has harsh sentiments against the West about. So we're going to maybe look at, in our next episode together, we're going to look at if any of the early church fathers, like what views they held on the filioque, and what scriptural grounds can be found, and maybe a little bit of what the Orthodox view is, obviously. So we'll dive deeper into that. And thanks again for coming on.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, no problem.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I think that will be one that you'll particularly be interested in.
Hopefully have a little bit more to say.
It's okay. I kind of sprung this on you a little bit last minute.
That's okay.
Yeah, but I appreciate you joining me today to talk about it.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll see you next time.
All right, bye.